The first book I ever wrote, I didn't have an agent. I sent it in over the transom, and I received a magnificent princely sum of about $1,000. I think I got about $3,000 in America. I'm making a grand total for the year of $4,000, on which my wife and I could live reasonably well in Dublin in 1973. And then we moved from Dublin to London on the strength of having a publisher. And we could also live there for a while. And then we couldn't, and my wife got a job, and I beavered away. You know. I forgot one of the golden rules too. One of the golden rules is you're all too old to really make use of this, but you should begin reading as early as possible, before kindergarten, if you can manage that, and read everything you can. Read good stuff for pleasure, and eventually to see how they're doing it. The more narrative techniques you can get into your head, the more different ways you can remember of putting together a chapter, of beginning a chapter, of ending a chapter, of the way you take characters out of their immediate surroundings and put them somewhere else. If you just see that done really well, then you know it can be done. I was a demonic reader. I once read that Charles Dickens said that when he was a boy, he read as if for life. I could cry every day. Because that is exactly the way I read. I inhaled books. My parents would say, "Don't you want to go outside, Peter?" I said, "Why?" "Well, you need a little fresh air." "Oh, okay." I go slump around the outside for a while and come back in and pick up the book that I've been panning to read. Or I cheat and bring the book with me. Now I've adopted this as a way of life. A literary agent who lives on our block once tweeted to Emma that he saw her father today again, and I was carrying a book. In fact, every single time he's seen me, I was carrying a book. This is what I do. You never want to recall without a book, do you? Now, that means that prose styles and ways of using punctuation and ways of putting sentences together are all floating around. And sometimes when I read, I very seldom do, read an older book of mine, I know where something came from. I was reading, I was at Bard on Monday, and Brad Morrow, my friend, asked me to read 3 or 4 pages from the novel Ghost Story. In that part of the chapter that I read, there was a sentence like, "The river glistened feebly." No, the water glistened in the grayness, or in the fog. Water glistened, and I realized I had gotten that word "glistened" from John Ashbery, from a poem I read years ago called "Into the Dust-Charged Air." The point of the poem, "Into the Dust-Charged Air," which is just ravishingly beautiful, is that it names damn near every river in the world. That's the point of the poem. And when he comes to the Ardèche, the French river, he says, "The Ardèche glistened feebly in the sun." That's glisten, that's where I got that from. I could point to lots of moments that were inspired by Iris Murdoch, a great influence on me for a very long time. Early in my career, I can see John Hawkes at work. I'm trying to play a keyboard that isn't mine. And I'm doing some kind of Hawksian things. But undoubtedly, everything is informed by something I read at one time. Well, that can be very interesting, I think. And I would trust what you feel is going to work rather than the kind of hard and fast black and white rules that I just half comically laid down. I was perfectly serious, but of course, I break those rules all the time, anyhow. So does everybody else. I just think they should be kept in mind. I think probably independent press is the way to go, and I think they'd be more receptive. I mean, I speak from a position of total ignorance. I don't know how much power there is in what you've done or how beautiful it is. However, somebody has to read your material. It's difficult to find an agent these days, but somewhere there is an agent who represents writers like yourself. You have to do a little homework and find out who that is. I should know, but I don't. Ira Silverberg is a brilliant agent, and he comes a little close, but he's such a star now that he probably isn't taking anybody new. If you look, and who are the writers you like?
Sylvia Plath. I guess it's my favorite author.
Okay.
I like horror writers, like psychological horror. Conrad Aiken, Melville.
Okay, wow. Well, all that's great stuff. You must find an agent, and it's doable. You write out modest letters inquiring whether he or she would be interested in reading your work, which is of this sort, of this kind. Response would be appreciated. Handle it, again, without ego. And somewhere, eventually, someone will say, send me your book, and then you'll see what happens. I don't think so. It was a fragment. I loved writing it. I loved the whole idea. So it was supposed to be a kind of a novella about a couple who's invited to a very exclusive camp or resort where you're flown to Norway and they put blindfolds on you and you're taken up in a helicopter and you wind up on the top of some mountain, and off in the distance you see a flag or something, and you walk toward it, and then you're in Perdido, where there are charming people and great food and brilliant things to do. If you're the right sort of person, you're invited back. If you're really the right sort of person, you're invited back to Mordido, which is the one further up the mountain. It's like classes on a yacht. People from Mordido can go down and swan around in Perdido rather regally, looking with something like disdain on the people who aren't quite as good as they are, but who may one day be as good as they are, and then retreat. The ultimate resort is called Endido. It's up at the top, and I think when you get to Endido, you never ever leave. So that was very workable, and I had all sorts of great little whiz-bangs and diversions that work in that book. And then I realized that where I was going to have to invent and describe at great length a long murder parlor game. And my spirit gave up. I thought, I don't want to do that. So I just stopped. And then Dennis Etchison, who was a friend of mine and a writer and editor, asked if I had anything to contribute to his book called Horror Museum. I said, no, Dennis, I don't. But on the other hand, actually, I can send you this fragment. It is a fragment. It's unfinished. It's long, but it isn't done. He said, oh, okay, send it to me and I'll read it. So I sent it to Dennis. About a week later, Dennis called me and said, Peter, I really like that, but I don't understand the ending. I said, Dennis, there is no ending. It's just cut off. It's like a severed limb. There's nothing there. It goes to the end and that's that. And he said, oh, okay. And then he published the book, and it's called Perdido, a fragment, or an unfinished manuscript or something like that. Now people think that is part of the title. So it's a finished manuscript pretending to be a fragment. And someone writes me and said, could you please explain what happens to those people in Perdido? Any jazz fan will know that I got these terms from jazz music. Perdido is a famous Duke Ellington song, and the jazz impresario Norman Granz every now and then put together a whole bunch of musicians, put them on stage, said play the blues, and he said now that was the famous Mordido. And then finally, when they put a whole bunch of trumpet players together, they said, okay, now these guys are going to play Perdido. The names didn't mean anything. No, they just looked good on record labels. James Joyce was exactly the kind of writer you described. He would write back to his sister and say, what exactly is in the window of the butcher shop today? How long does it take to walk from Grafton Street to the Liffey? You know, how many steps did it take? He wanted literal realism. I used to work with maps. I took great delight in writing down street names from maps. These days it's easy. You look everything up on the internet. You can even use the map thing where you can go look at the places. You know, you can describe the people who are actually there. I began to change my mind about this when my wife and I were on vacation in that Caribbean islands, half Dutch and half French.
St. Martin's.
St. Martin's. We were at a lovely little resort, and I was doing what I am happiest doing is that I'd get up, I'd swim, we'd eat something, I'd swim, I'd go write for a little while, I'd swim a little more, then I'd go write a little more. My wife is being very tolerant about this. Every now and then we'd go off for a toddle into town. But actually, I was buzzing along very, very well. And then I had a problem. This was, again, that novel Coco, which took me 4 years to write. I was trying to describe what a guy in a hotel called the Pfister Hotel sees when he looks down a window onto the side of the hotel. There's a big street, there's a square, there's a cathedral, and there's a man hitting a bus with a wrench. He's running alongside the bus, banging it on. And I said, Susie, what's the name of that street that goes along the top of the Pfister? And she said, that's Jackson Street. And I realized, yes, that is Jackson Street. But I also realized I could make it all up. I could still call it Milwaukee. And I could take much more freedom. I could melt Milwaukee a little bit and make its boundaries more surreal and peculiar and slightly menacing. So after that, whenever I wanted to invoke my own feelings about Milwaukee or things that happened in Milwaukee, I invented a city called Mill Haven, which I put in Illinois. So good old Milwaukeeans and Wisconsinites wouldn't be offended by what I was doing in a city that, after all, I was rather fond of. The furthest afield I took poor dear Milwaukee was to the Caribbean. When I made it to the island of Milwaukee. It's the only Polish-German island in the Caribbean. There's a street called Kaye Drosselmeyerstrasse. This was my romantic comedy. Anyhow, that's the reason. There's much more freedom. So. That's a tough question. Are you asking if there's anything I know that can be used to draw readers in to a situation that will lead them toward a payoff?
Right. I mean, like in terms of like what you do, is there something that you measure or track? Like you measure how many things you set up versus what you pay off?
I don't, but I do it intuitively. I have a sense, and one must have a sense of how long things should be drawn out before the crucial action happens. And again, the dirty secret comes in. It doesn't really matter what they do in the meantime. They can talk. Whatever they say is going to be important. Whatever they do, if they fall asleep or drive the car into a ditch, it's all going to pay off later. But it just pads the matter out without seeming like padding, so that when a certain amount of tension builds up, and so when finally the shit hits the fan, and you get to the climax, people feel it as a climax. They feel as though there's a sudden relief. But you have to put in the daily, quotidian matters, the thoughts that go through their minds, the meals they eat, whatever, to keep you from tipping your hand too early.
So in a nutshell, it's like you plant a seed and you wait for it to emotionally ripen in the audience.
In every way, in every way. I've many times had the experience of looking back at the first pages of a novel when I'm on like the 400th page and be struck dumb that I did something I didn't understand then, but is coming to fruition way back here. This is what happens if you don't have much of a memory anymore. Novelists are supposed to remember every single thing that happens in the book. Hemingway gave the very good advice, though impossible to follow, of every day beginning to read at the beginning of your manuscript, all the way up to where you stopped. And he also recommended stopping in a place where you knew what was going to happen next, so you could jump off and have a little momentum. That's a great technique. This gentleman laughed because it might take you 2 days to catch up to where you were. You must, I can't remember, I used to have the greatest memory imaginable. I remember everything that ever happened. And then holes began to develop. And now I make my way between between the black holes and try to patch together experience. But nothing is ever truly lost, thank goodness. And so somewhere there are things just awaiting their turn. You can tell very early on when you start reading a book whether the author knows what he's doing about pacing. If things go slack, he doesn't have a clue. And his editor didn't bother telling him what he should do either. When I say it doesn't matter what you do, I'm also saying that it always matters what they do. It could be one of any number of alternatives, though. And when Charles Dickens got up on one morning and he had breakfast and he reported to the desk, if he had Martin Chuzzlewit have a pot of ale and a turkey pie, he just made that up. Martin Chuzzlewit could have said, "No, I don't have breakfast today. I want to go to America instead." But instead, he went through these things that Dickens described by plucking likely sounding realistic details out of the air. You can't sustain a novel on actions like that, on moments like that. They must all filter toward some greater meaning, something larger, more meaningful.